So there's this video by a user called Mental Health Master. The video is essentially an effort to debunk many of the MAP or pedophile advocacy positions. Mental Health Master sets out to demonstrate, by using statistics and science, not only how stigma against pedophiles isn't an obstacle for their therapy-seeking behavior, as some fools might think, but also that we as a society in fact need stigma to keep these pedophiles in check. He also absolutely obliterates the notion that pedophilia is immutable by showing, again with hard science, how in fact pedophilia can be cured, and that it's total nonsense to think otherwise, as again some poor apologists might argue. Mental Health Master, or just Quinton to use his more humble, down-to-earth name, is a mental health professional, a real therapist, whose expertise no doubt far surpasses mine on this subject, and anything psychology related really, and it probably would be a bad idea to dare critique such an authority. Still, I foolishly went against my better judgment and decided to do exactly that, and hence this series addressing his contentions. Because despite his stages as a professional, if you really pause to consider his arguments and the studies he cites, they just aren't that convincing. For example, he wants there to be stigma against MAPs, while his own YouTube banner seems to contradict him. It's like he holds that stigma related to mental health issues is simultaneously bad, neutral, and even a positive thing, which again seems like a contradiction. Admittedly, he tries to use statistics to substantiate his claim that stigma has no negative effect on MAP's therapy-seeking behavior. The problem is, it's an interpretation that just cannot logically be made from the statistics he uses. But it gets even worse. His only real academic reference for a potential cure for pedophilia, Fedoroff's 2014 study, has been heavily critiqued by other academics for its various flaws, a fact which he conveniently leaves out from his rant, while he accuses others of having a confirmation bias. These are all points I will come back to as we play Quinton's video claim by claim. Each episode of my 3-part video response to Quinton centers on one main theme, and they can be regarded as separate critiques. So if the topic of one of these episodes doesn't particularly interest you, there's no harm in skipping to another one. This part examines predominantly Quinton's assertion that pedophilia is inherently dangerous, and the argument he endeavors to build around that premise. The second part focuses on his hypothesis about stigmatization and pedophiles, basically how he undermines the harmfulness of stigma and even advocates it in the context of MAPs. God forbid pedos, they were in this guy's office. The final episode is about his contention that pedophilia can be cured. As usual, you'll find my sources in the description. Okay, the very beginning of Quinton's video is not terribly unreasonable. He basically points out that it depends on our definitions of sexuality and sexual orientation if we are to consider pedophilia those. And as regards these definitions, there's no real consensus. In my previous videos, I've already discussed this and provided evidence for why pedophilia could be considered a sexual age orientation, and here I'm referring especially to Michael Seto's work. But since Quinton doesn't dwell on this, I won't do that either. Unfortunately, after these sensible comments, his video quickly degenerates into something worse. Let's play a few clips.
And from everything that I've observed and from all the interactions that I've had, it seems to me that a primary purpose of a lot of these individuals who describe themselves as minor attracted persons is to normalize their sexual attractions. That's why we see the argument about sexual orientation, because by arguing that, they are implying that their attraction is the same as any other attraction, when it is not, hence the gaslighting.
So this person actually uses the term gaslighting 4 times in his video. Now, it's okay to have these pet concepts, but at least based on the definitions I found for gaslighting, his usage of the term doesn't seem to make awfully lot of sense or even be consistent. It's like we are witnessing this phenomenon wherein people become so interested in or obsessed by a single concept that they start seeing it everywhere, but I digress. Anyway, he seems to think that if someone claims pedophilia is a sexual orientation, that means they are implying it's the same as any other sexual attraction. Is that really the case? Homosexuality is usually considered a sexual orientation together with heterosexuality, but few people regard these as the same. Like, you can't procreate in a homosexual relationship, for instance. Besides, logically, 2 different concepts can never be the same. They can merely be more or less similar. So it seems Quinton, in a kind of strawman fashion, is conflating the point that pedophilia and homosexuality might have similarities and might both be considered an orientation, with the claim that there are no differences. Of course there are differences. Pedophiles have fewer ethical ways to express their sexuality, for example. Since Mental Health Master, no doubt in his masterful wisdom, resolved to critique specifically non-offending maps, those he argues against and their allies are perfectly willing to admit this distinction, which makes his argument all the more flawed. Speaking of which, why is this guy even picking on non-offending maps anyway, instead of pedos who actually do support, like, child-adult sex for instance? Isn't it curious that his biggest grievance with maps seems to be with the ones doing the least harm? It's almost as if anti-pedos are annoyed by maps who are honorable, the existence of which conflicts with their self-righteous objective to vilify them categorically. And to fix this cognitive dissonance, they set out on this crusade against non-offending maps in particular. But I'm not the psychology expert here, like Mental Health Master, so maybe I'm just wrong.
That's why we see this conversation surrounding whether they are contact or no contact minor attracted persons, because they are implying that the attraction alone isn't a problem. It's only a problem if they act upon it. And again, all of this is just gaslighting, because it's taking away from the actual important aspect of this, which is that they are attracted to a vulnerable population. And by being attracted to a vulnerable population, regardless of everything that I just discussed, there is an inherent risk if that attraction is expressed.
This is honestly sort of poor reasoning, because you can make the same argument against heterosexual males, as women are physically vulnerable in relation to males. It's just biology. We can even consider straight males who are attracted to small women in particular. That would mean they're attracted to particularly vulnerable population, wouldn't it? Obviously, small and physically weak adults can still consent to sex as opposed to kids. But then again, rape is a real concept, so despite them being able to consent, women are still vulnerable as potential targets of rape. Needless to say, unless you're going to apply this logic to heterosexual males and vilify them too, it also fails as regards maps.
I want to be clear that I do sympathize with individuals who are attracted to children, because all of the research currently supports that it isn't something that they choose, that is something that develops. I'm going to talk more about that later. However, we also have to be realistic about the fact that that attraction does carry an inherent risk. And due to that fact, I do support treatment, but I do not support normalization.
Appeal to pedophiles' risk or dangerousness is a classical anti-pedo argument. While definitely one of the better ones put forward by the antis, it's still inadequate in and of itself and what it's geared to justify in their ideology, that is, the discrimination of maps. First of all, if we have a population that is dangerous, does it follow that we ought to stigmatize them? Is bullying them going to make them less dangerous somehow? For example, people with schizophrenia could be considered dangerous, but few people would argue that therefore they should be marginalized, dehumanized, and excluded from society. In fact, it seems likely that driving these populations underground would turn out to be counterproductive if our first priority lies in preventing harm. I will go into more detail about the detrimental effects of stigma in part 2, so we'll leave this area for now. The question still remains, are pedophiles dangerous? As with the debate whether pedophilia is a sexual orientation, it depends on how we define these concepts. It's at least my experience of discussing with anti-pedophiles that usually they are totally uninvested in defining the concepts that are central to their arguments, probably because that would require thinking, and they're not very good at it, so I've done some work for them. Next, I present 3 categories of dangerousness that I've identified as I've thought about this. I intend to demonstrate that no matter which definition of risk we subscribe to, appeal to pedophiles' dangerousness just isn't a strong argument. I call the first category statistical dangerousness. It basically manifests at a group level and doesn't take into account individual variation. So, for instance, we could say males have a statistical risk of being rapists due to their biology, or that poor people have a statistical risk of committing crime in general due to having less to lose and being desperate. Additionally, members of immigrant groups in some cases may have a similar heightened risk due to not all of them exactly integrating into society. In the same vein, when compared with telephiles, that is, adults who are attracted to other adults mainly, pedophiles as a group probably molest children more. After all, pedophilia is one of the motives for sexual offending against kids. I guess I should stress here that while it's not fallacious in and of itself to regard these populations on solely group level for what kind of risk they pose, it's still just generalizing and the opposite of judging a man based on the contents of his character, or in the case of a pedophile, the strength of his impulse control, for example. But let's say we opt for using this category of dangerousness anyway. Then pedophiles are dangerous as a collective. But the critical problem for antis is that as they use this line of reasoning, they completely ignore or disregard when pointed out the statistical risk of, for example, aforementioned males, poor people, or immigrants. In other words, if they are not willing to apply the same standard to these other statistically dangerous groups, some of which they probably belong to themselves. So while we might sympathize why they are biased, the truth is their position is inconsistent. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There are still two categories of dangerousness that might be just what they need for their argument. Although, spoiler alert, they don't work either. I was just trying to keep the suspense going. My second category of dangerousness is what I call potential dangerousness. This concept is highly relational in the sense that people, animals, things, or places are potentially dangerous rather from someone's perspective than by themselves. Essentially, it's the lack of knowledge of different variables that incites us to label these things as potentially dangerous. For example, children are taught by their parents not to pet strange dogs, not because parents think all strange dogs bite. Children are taught this because they have no means to tell the effectively safe dogs from the effectively dangerous ones that will bite. Therefore, the whole category of strange dogs can be labeled as potentially dangerous. By the way, as hinted before, also things and places can be labeled dangerous in this sense. For instance, it's easy to imagine how a dark forest teeming with ominous sounds must have been a source of constant alarm for a prehistoric man who couldn't ascertain in the dark if there were predators lurking in the shadows. Perhaps our innate fear of dark can be traced to exactly this, as an evolutionary trait, a correlate to that which hides things from us and therefore invokes potential danger. So are pedophiles potentially dangerous? Of course, from many perspectives, but whose perspective is the operative one? That is the perspective that justifies the objective labeling of them as dangerous. Does the perspective of the pedophile himself count? After all, if a pedophile feels he knows himself well enough and trusts himself not to be a danger to kids, then we have at least one person who doesn't believe all pedophiles are potentially dangerous. But let's say all pedos are biased and cannot evaluate their own risk. I don't believe this is necessarily the case, but we can assume that for the sake of argument. Well, then we still have, for example, the therapist of pedophiles to consider, some of whom, owing to the diversity of this population, no doubt have made a professional assessment that their patient, whom they know, poses no risk to children. Again, if this is the type of dangerousness we want to go by, then it seems we have to debate over whose subjective assessment is the correct one, and if no one is objectively right, as you may think is the answer, then isn't that itself a serious problem to this generic argument of appealing to pedophiles' dangerousness? Because then we're just reducing it to a matter of opinion, not a fact. I still have a little more to add before we move on to the next category. I hope I'm not boring you. It's just that Quinton's contention about pedophiles' dangerousness is such an integral and recurring argument in anti-pedophile parlance that I see value in addressing it to the fullest. Now, perhaps someone could try to argue all pedophiles are potentially dangerous if at least some people believe so. For example, parents of small kids, or even kids themselves. As a child, I was scared of pedophiles, mostly because adults around me were super hysterical about them. But if this really is the standard, aren't we again logically forced to extend the same judgment on males in general? Because there's bound to be a number of rape victims who view all strange males as a threat, especially when they meet them on a dark alley or something. Besides, this doesn't resolve the whole issue with subjectivity really, it's still there. I mean, even if we have folks who think all pedophiles are dangerous, because it's not a universal belief, we also have those who don't think so. So these contentions would sort of cancel each other out anyway. An appeal to majority here seems fallacious too, because you can sort of understand that it can't be derived from a vote whether pedophiles are dangerous or not, as that's not the way you establish a fact really. In conclusion, as far as I see, the concept of potential risk just isn't rigorous enough to be used in any argument with real objective integrity. Now, as the idea behind potential danger can be understood as our personal anxiety over that which may prove actually harmful, such as the strange dog that in fact attacks children, this allows us to quite naturally derive another category of dangerousness. It's the third and final definition I have, and I call it effective dangerousness. I guess you could also refer to it as actual or true dangerousness, because it also gives the right impression. To be honest, when I consider all these categories, philosophically, this would appear the most serviceable one, as it's neither subjective nor generalizing. That is, it's not a matter of opinion, and it appreciates variation on the level of the individual. To explain this one, I'll use the thought experiment. Imagine a person in a room with two guns. He knows that both guns are loaded, but only one has a bullet in it. He has to pick one and shoot himself with it. Even though, from his perspective, both guns are potentially dangerous due to him not knowing which one has the bullet, surely the guns are still not the same. Indeed, I'd argue there's a fundamental difference, as only one of them is effectively dangerous, the one with the bullet, because obviously a gun is only harmful in as much as it has ammo. I guess you could analogize the gun with the bullet to a pedophile who in fact will end up hurting kids. And yes, we have no absolute knowledge over which pedophiles are like the gun with the bullet and which ones are like the gun that is effectively safe. But unless we entertain the obviously fallacious thought that all pedophiles eventually molest, they can't be all labeled as effectively dangerous. To summarize, in adherence to my three categories of dangerousness, the appeal to pedophiles' risk is simply an inadequate argument, as either all maps can't be considered that, or should our definition allow us to hold that view, it still inescapably leads to inconsistencies, wherein the anti-pedophile is not willing to admit the risk of all the other so-called dangerous groups, even though that risk is derived using the same logic. Before we move on to the next clip, I'll just briefly respond to two possible criticisms against my contentions, in particular on why I insist on comparing maps and males in general in a seemingly unfair manner. Firstly, one might suggest that since being male is only normal and natural, it can't be compared with a deviation such as pedophilia, and hence assigning both risk must be fallacious. Well, it's also normal and natural for some species of snakes to be venomous. Surely that doesn't mean venomous snakes aren't dangerous. Another similar pseudo-criticism would be to assert that my comparison is unfair, as it's only certain type of male that commits rape, for example those who disrespect women enough to violate them. Sure, then again, you can just as easily assert that it's certain type of pedophile that molests, namely those with poor impulse control, or signs of an anti-personality disorder, or some other critical flaw besides their sexuality. Anyway, I guess we gotta move on.
And I find it really interesting that 100% of the individuals that I have either observed or interacted with online state that they are no contact. Now, I'm not asserting that there are individuals who are lying, though that could be quite possible. What I'm asserting is that we can never be sure of the impact that our environment will have on us in the future, and that there are very many environmental stressors that can cause us to behave in ways that we would rather choose not to behave. And when it comes to paraphilic disorders, those environmental stressors can be a trigger to expressing those innate desires.
Note how Quinton makes this ever so subtle insinuation of dishonesty when he reflects on these non-offending pedophiles he has met online. Instead of recognizing their sacrifice and perhaps even say a few nice words about them, he opts for this toned-down version of the same approach Shoe on Head exhibited in her ramblings about pedophiles. This approach that leaves no conceptual room for a legitimate, responsible pedophile, for even when they appear as such, antis will conveniently just appeal to map's supposed dishonesty. It's basically a sly tactic used to disregard any exceptions to the morally reprehensible pedophile they encounter, lest any nuance seep into their conception of pedophile and make them doubt for a moment the veracity of their beliefs. Another variation of this tactic is to dismiss all non-offending pedophiles as just people who haven't had an opportunity to act yet. Of course, those with a better grasp of reality immediately conceive that it would be highly unlikely that all cases of non-offending pedophiles could be reduced to that. At least Quinton makes the sensible point that the environment may trigger people to, let's say, act in ways not entirely admirable. Of course, this applies to people generally, so it's hardly an argument against pedophiles specifically. I mean, it's not like only maps have this obligation to conduct themselves by putting feelings aside and be covered by a higher principle when necessary and all that. Besides, he ignores the other equally important component to all this, which is the individual the environment acts upon. By doing this, he overlooks the immense diversity of pedophiles as a population regarding their morals, impulse control, empathy, etc. He probably does this because he has this argument that we can't trust pedophiles anyway, so let's hear the guy out.
It's an innate response for us to react or be on guard when given certain information. If an individual tells you that they often think about killing other people, you're going to be more on guard around that individual with that information. And so if an individual tells you that they're attracted to a child, how are you going to ask them not to do the same? And with everything we just heard, how is it ethical or moral to ask people to normalize that attraction? And this is where that whole no contact minor attracted person or hashtag no map thing just becomes ridiculous, because what they are stating is basically that you should trust their intentions and their future behaviors based solely on their word. When statistically speaking, 50 to 60% of perpetrators of child sexual abuse have an attraction towards children.
I combined these clips because Quinton raises similar points in them, insisting we should be on guard around pedophiles and that we can't trust their word when they profess they conduct themselves responsibly. I think there must be some confusion here, as I've never heard of anyone argue that you have to trust random pedophiles down the street or something. It's like this guy thinks there are two possibilities. Either you have to trust individual pedophiles in your day-to-day life, or you have to judge and vilify them. This is an example of false dichotomy or false dilemma, and next I'll show you why it's fallacious. So the thing is, people don't trust strange people in general. For instance, I wouldn't lend my wallet to a random fellow passenger on my bus ride for the duration of the rest of the day, even if that was made somehow advantageous to me. Let's say I would get an ice cream when the wallet is returned at the end of the day. But isn't that the thing? I wouldn't know if I'd see my wallet ever again. That still doesn't mean I think anyone that gets on my local bus deserves to be shunned and labeled as a thief. Therefore, not being able to trust certain people is not the kind of discrimination that's the problem here. Indeed, it's hardly a choice to trust someone or not to begin with. It's a sentiment in your head, and whatever feelings you have, you're surely entitled to have. Then again, believing so is probably what distinguishes me from these people I argue against in my videos anyway. Now, considering I don't have an issue with people not trusting pedophiles if they feel they really can't, what's the kind of discrimination I have issue with? Well, to just briefly name a few things. Firstly, there's the legal aspect. The law shouldn't punish for victimless thought crimes such as lolicon or child sex dolls, for fuck's sake. Secondly, there's the social aspect. Even if people couldn't trust pedophiles generally in their everyday life, they should at least on the level of intellect recognize and acknowledge their individuality in terms of their criminality and risk. In other words, I'd argue individual maps vary significantly and certainly shouldn't be considered a hive mind, where one bad pedophile gets to represent all. That is, it's really high time society extend the principle to not generalize about people to pedophiles too, because the same logic applies even when it's less politically correct to think so. And if some of this sounds paradoxical, it's not really. Think back to the thought experiment with the guy and the gun. Just as he's justified to regard both guns as potentially dangerous, he should realize with equal lucidity that one of them is still effectively safe, despite not knowing which one. In conclusion, some pedophiles are effectively dangerous and some of them are not. Surely the uncertainty over knowing one from the other is not a reason to collectively condemn them, but rather a reason not to do so. In the next part, we'll examine Quinton's silly notions that stigmatization against maps doesn't hurt them, and that it's even something society needs to facilitate and sustain. Turns out he's once again wrong, logically and scientifically, plain and simple. As I have all the scripts ready, the next part should be up in about a week, so I hope I'll see you then. That's all I have. Thanks for listening.